Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. A university library is supposed to feel safe, quiet, predictable, almost sealed off from the world outside. You walk between shelves, hear the occasional turning page, and assume everyone around you is there for the same ordinary reason. But on November 28, 1969, something happened inside Penn State University's Pattee library that shattered that sense of safety. A young graduate student named Betsy Aardsma was attacked among the books. In a case that remains unsolved more than half a century later, Betsy was 22 years old and studying English at Penn State. That Friday, she went to the library to research a paper. It was the day after Thanksgiving, a time when many students were away from campus and the university was quieter than usual. Betsy's reason for being there was completely routine. She needed information, and the library stacks offered access to books that could help. Nothing about that simple academic errand suggested that she was in danger. Pattee Library was a large, complex building, with rows of shelves arranged into numbered aisles. These stacks could feel isolated even when the library was open. Tall bookcases interrupted sight lines, and a person standing only a short distance away might be completely hidden. Sound traveled strangely, too. A noise could be heard without its source being immediately clear. In 1969, there were no security cameras quietly recording who entered a particular aisle or what happened there. Betsy made her way into the stacks and entered aisle 51. At some point, while she was standing among the shelves, another person approached her. We don't know whether she recognized that person. We don't know if they spoke, argued, or stood together in silence. What investigators eventually determined was that someone drove a blade into her chest with a single forceful thrust. There was no prolonged attack and no series of wounds, just one delivered with fatal precision. Then came the sounds that drew attention from elsewhere in the library. Witnesses reported hearing screams, followed by the crash of books falling from the shelves. It's possible Betsy grabbed at the bookcase or knocked books loose as she collapsed. Whatever happened in those few seconds, the disturbance was loud enough to be noticed. Yet because of the arrangement of the stacks, hearing something was not the same as seeing it. The shelves concealed the most important moment of the crime. Now here's where the sequence becomes especially strange. Witnesses saw two unidentified men leaving the area near aisle 51. As they departed, one of them reportedly said that someone should help the girl. It was an unusual statement. The men apparently knew that a woman needed assistance, but they did not remain to explain what they had seen. They did not identify themselves, and despite the attention their behavior would later receive, neither man was ever conclusively located and publicly identified. People who went into the aisle found Betsy lying on the floor among scattered books, but they did not immediately understand that they were looking at the scene of a stabbing. There was very little visible blood. Her clothing concealed the wound, and the external injury was not obvious to those trying to help. With no knife in sight and no clear sign of violence, the first explanation seemed medical. Responders believed Betsy might have suffered a seizure or another sudden health emergency. That misunderstanding mattered. The area was approached as the site of a medical crisis, not as a potential murder scene. People focused, understandably, on getting Betsy help. She was moved from the library and taken to the campus health center. Only there, after medical personnel examined her more closely, was the wound in her chest discovered. By that point, the reality was unavoidable. Betsy had not simply collapsed. She had been attacked, and the seemingly ordinary library aisle was now a crime scene. Efforts to save her were unsuccessful. Betsy Aardsma was pronounced dead, leaving investigators with a killing that had taken place in a public university building, but had somehow gone largely unseen. An autopsy established the cause, a single stab wound through the chest. The blade had penetrated deeply enough to cause catastrophic internal damage. The lack of blood in the aisle had been deceptive. Much of the bleeding was internal, hidden from the first people who came to her aid. So let's back up a second. Think about how quickly this must have happened. Betsy enters aisle 51 to look for research material. Someone gets close enough to strike her once. Books crash. She falls. Two men are then seen leaving the area, and one refers to a girl who needs help. By the time others reach Betsy, whoever attacked her has disappeared into or beyond the library. The entire event may have unfolded in the time it takes to walk through a few rows of shelves. The single wound raised difficult questions. Was the attacker experienced with a knife or simply lucky? Was the strike planned or delivered in a sudden burst of anger? One wound can suggest a focused attack, but it doesn't explain the state of mind behind it. There was no recovered weapon to study. Investigators could not match a blade to the injury, test it for fingerprints, or trace its ownership. Whoever carried it away also removed one of the most direct links to the crime. There was another problem. No clear motive emerged. Betsy had not been robbed, at least not in any way that offered an obvious explanation. Investigators had to consider whether she had been targeted by someone she knew, confronted by a stranger, or caught in an encounter that escalated without warning. Each possibility led in a different direction. and without a surviving eyewitness to the actual stabbing, detectives had to reconstruct relationships, movements, and fragments of conversation after the fact. Pennsylvania State Police took on the investigation and began questioning people connected to Betsy and to the library. Students, acquaintances, university employees, and potential witnesses all became important. Detectives needed to know who had been inside Pattee Library, who might have seen Betsy, and whether anyone had noticed suspicious behavior before or after the screams. But on a university campus, even during a quiet holiday weekend, the number of possible witnesses could be large and their recollections could be incomplete. The library itself created an investigative challenge. A person could enter the stacks for an entirely innocent reason, move between floors, and leave without drawing attention. There was no digital access log documenting each visitor's path. No phone location data could place a suspect beside aisle 51. Detectives depended on human memory: clothing, hair, approximate height, a face glimpsed for only a moment. Those details can be useful, but they can also blur quickly, especially after a sudden and confusing emergency. Investigators paid particular attention to the two men reported near the aisle. Witness information was used to produce and circulate a composite image. The hope was straightforward: someone might recognize the face and provide a name. Police also appealed for information about the men's identities and movements, but a composite is not a photograph. It is an interpretation assembled from memory, and even a sincere witness may struggle to accurately recall someone seen briefly in an unexpected situation. The remark attributed to one of the men remained deeply troubling: someone should help the girl. How did he know she needed help? Had he seen her fall? Had he heard the scream and looked into the aisle? Was he frightened, confused, or trying to distance himself from what had happened? And were both men involved, or neither? The statement sounds significant, but without knowing who made it or why, its meaning remains uncertain. It is a clue suspended without context. It's important not to turn uncertainty into proof. Leaving the area may appear suspicious, especially when a person nearby has been mortally wounded. But suspicious behavior alone does not establish guilt. The two men could have witnessed part of the incident and panicked. They could have misunderstood what they saw, just as the first responders misunderstood Betsy's condition. One could have been the attacker while the other knew nothing, or their proximity might have been coincidental. Investigators had possibilities, not a definitive answer. Betsy's own life was examined because, in any homicide investigation, detectives looked closely at the victim's relationships and recent experiences. Who knew her schedule? Who knew she planned to be in the library? Had she expressed fear of anyone? Was there tension in her personal life? Numerous people were questioned, but questioning does not mean accusation, and suspicion does not mean evidence. The investigation generated names and theories, yet none produced a case strong enough to result in criminal charges. Meanwhile, the initial confusion in aisle 51 complicated the physical evidence. Because no one first realized a violent crime had occurred, the area was not immediately treated with the precautions expected at a homicide scene. People had entered to help. Betsy had been moved. Books were scattered on the floor. Any trace left behind had to be separated from the ordinary contact expected in a public library and from the contact of those who responded after she fell. Forensic science was also far more limited than it is today. Investigators could examine fingerprints, fibers, blood types, and the physical characteristics of a wound, but they did not have modern DNA profiling. They could not enhance distant security footage because no such footage existed. They could not search electronic records showing where a person's phone had traveled. The case depended on traditional police work: interviews, timelines, physical searches, background checks, and the hope that someone would provide the missing piece. Police questioned numerous individuals over time, and the case attracted both public attention and speculation. As years passed, different names were discussed by investigators, writers, and people interested in the mystery. Some theories centered on individuals within Betsy's social world. Others focused on men believed to have been in or around the library. But no theory overcame the central evidentiary problem. A compelling suspicion is not the same as proof, particularly when the weapon is missing and the attack itself had no confirmed eyewitness. And then there's the question of planning. If the killing was premeditated, the attacker chose an unusual location, public but visually concealed. The person may have known the arrangement of the stacks and understood how quickly someone could disappear. But if it was spontaneous, aisle 51 may have been nothing more than the place where an encounter went wrong. Both explanations fit parts of what is known. Neither can be confirmed from the surviving facts. The date adds another layer. The day after Thanksgiving meant fewer people on campus, fewer familiar faces, and perhaps fewer staff members or students moving through the building. That could have helped an attacker avoid detection. On the other hand, a quieter library might make any scream or crash more noticeable. The setting offered concealment but not silence. Someone did hear Betsy. Someone did notice the books, and at least two men were seen leaving. The crime was hidden but only barely. Betsy had gone into the library for paper, an ordinary task tied to the future she was building. That detail is easy to lose when a case becomes a collection of clues. She was not simply the woman in aisle 51. She was a graduate student with work to complete, relationships, plans, and people expecting to see her again. The violence reduced her final moments to a mystery, but it should not reduce her life to the manner of her death. For her family, the absence of an arrest meant there was never a courtroom explanation. No testimony laid out a sequence of events. No defendant was required to answer the accusation. There was no verdict to establish, at least legally. Who entered that aisle with her and why? Instead, the family was left with an investigation that continued to generate questions while withholding the one answer that mattered most, the identity of the person responsible. Over the decades, the case remained known partly because of its stark circumstances. A young woman, a quiet library, fallen books, two unidentified men, and a wound almost no one noticed until it was too late. Those elements are haunting. But they can also encourage people to fill gaps with assumptions. The responsible way to examine the case is to keep returning to what can actually be established and to clearly separate that from what is only possible. What can be established is this: Betsy entered Pattee Library on November 28, 1969 to conduct research. She was attacked in aisle 51. Witnesses heard screams and books falling. Two unidentified men were observed leaving the area, with one indicating that a girl needed help. Betsy was initially thought to be suffering from a seizure because little blood was visible. At the health center, the stab wound was found. The autopsy confirmed that one thrust had killed her. What cannot be established is just as important. Investigators never publicly identified the killer. They never recovered the weapon. They never proved a motive. They could not conclusively determine whether the attacker was a stranger, an acquaintance, or someone closer to Betsy, and they could not establish the precise role, if any, of the two men seen near the stacks. Every proposed solution eventually runs into one or more of those missing foundations. Could the case still be solved? In principle, old investigations can change when preserved evidence is tested with newer methods, when forgotten records are reviewed, or when a witness finally speaks. But that possibility depends on what material remains and whether it contains something probative. Time can help through technology, yet it also takes witnesses away and weakens memory. In Betsy's case, any new claim would still need careful corroboration. A name alone would not be enough. There is also a lesson here about first impressions. Because Betsy's injury produced little visible blood, the people around her interpreted the scene as a medical emergency. That reaction was reasonable based on what they could see, but it concealed the true nature of the event during crucial early moments. The case reminds us that violence does not always look the way people expect. A fatal injury can be almost invisible from the outside, even when its internal consequences are immediate. And consider the attacker. Whoever delivered that single wound was close enough to Betsy to reach her chest, then managed to leave without being conclusively identified. Whether the person walked calmly away or fled in panic is unknown. Whether they returned to an ordinary life afterward is unknown. But unless the killer died soon after, that person lived for years with knowledge no one else possessed, exactly what happened in aisle 51 and why. Today, the shelves and buildings of a university may change, students come and go, and technology transforms how campuses are monitored. Yet the core of this case remains fixed in a few minutes from 1969. Betsy Aardsma walked into a library to research a paper. A scream broke the quiet, books fell, two men left the area, and beneath her clothing was the single wound that would turn an ordinary Friday into one of Penn State's most enduring mysteries. The Pennsylvania State Police investigated, questioned numerous people, and circulated a composite based on witness information. Still, no one was charged. Without the weapon, a proven motive, or a witness who could identify the attacker, the case stalled. Betsy's murder remains officially unsolved. Somewhere between the shelves of aisle 51 and the exits of Pattee Library, a person disappeared into the late November afternoon, leaving behind fallen books, unanswered questions, and a silence that has lasted for decades. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.